Oh no, this isn't the start of the episode yet, but bear with me. We're going to be publishing the first season of Aquilo as a real, physical, can hold in your hands book. But we need your help to get it done. Head on over to aquilo.com/book to get all the details, including a few surprises. Aquilo Season 7 Chapter 11 Doris Would Never. My father, Camille Dufour, is not an easy man. He's a complex character buried under the most unassuming of facades, a man with a fraught history that hides behind layers of simplicity, if only to avoid having to tell his story over and over again. From what little bits and pieces Eric and I have been able to assemble, putting them together like a puzzle, it's not a pleasant story to tell in the first place. For a while now, I've been pondering how come I can't remember the woman in all those photos that cover the walls of my apartment. How is it that I've gone my whole life not knowing of this great-grandaunt who lived over a century and had a passion for cooking? One would think this is the sort of topic that would come up at a family reunion. To stir the broth further, everything I've learned of Doris seems to suggest that she was a wonderful woman who did nothing but great things for those around her. It seems a crime to keep that from your children, yet my father never even mentioned that branch of the family to us. How different would things have been if we'd come to Aquilo a few times every summer, or stopped for a hot cocoa on one of those 2 trips to Florida we took during the winter of my early teens. But something happened between Camille and that branch of the family. While we did grow up with the benefit of knowing our grandparents, at some point a rift between my father and his uncle cracked open. One day we'd be told that Granduncle Edgar had died, then a few years later we'd hear he stole money from Grandma. The testimony would never be the same, and more often than not, we were told it wasn't for us to worry about. With Dad being so difficult to talk to, we were more than happy to oblige. All that to say, there remains a veil of mystery cast over that side of my family. One so opaque that even after inheriting the Aquilo Cafe, I've yet to receive a proper explanation from Dad. He claims ignorance about the cafe, but remains evasive about Doris. Watching the shot glass fall from Ophelia's hand, a stray thought of giving him the drink dances through my mind. It's a short performance, one interrupted by the sound of glass shattering on ceramic tiles and the echo of Ophelia's words. Doris Dufour killed my parents. It's an outrageous claim, one that I would normally be inclined to dismiss just as another dig from Ophelia. It would be an out-of-character jab, one that cut deeper than most, and an accusation too heavy for casual rivalry. Then again, the memory of her broken finger, dripping with blood under the floodlights of the forest, tells a tale of desperation. And when desperate enough, even a cornered squirrel might act out of character. Ophelia's quivering jaw and grinding teeth, combined with her unblinking wide stare, tells a different story, though. Annabelle's little trick worked. Where it drew from Eric and me fairly innocuous confessions, it carved into Ophelia and drew out a secret motivation. While perhaps not true, the horrid little secret the alcohol dragged from her guts is something she believes, something she wanted to keep to herself. And for the first time since crossing the threshold of the Aquilo, I see Ophelia. Not the little knitting witch with a sharp tongue, or Gulliver's pesky girlfriend, not even the rival who'd set up shop down the street from me. Rapid, shallow breaths warn of an oncoming panic attack. Like the hare faced by the hunter, I expect her to bolt at any moment, wasting no time using the door and crashing instead through the front window. Annabelle and Petunia both turn to me, the so-called adult in the room, waiting to take my cue or worried about my reaction. Meanwhile, Gulliver looks afraid, suspicious, and worried, but nowhere on his features do I detect a hint of surprise. "Okay," I whisper, walking the tightrope between soothing and assertive. "Come here." Like a child, I reach my hand over Ophelia's shoulders, taking them gently between my fingers. "What did I say?" she demands, soft at first, but with increasing intensity. "What did I say?" "Shh," I soothe, pulling her away from the counter. Normally, when dealing with someone undergoing some sort of trauma, I automatically treat them like a fragile piece of china. They're a delicate cup set precariously atop a priceless saucer, and I manipulate them with adequate care. Ophelia feels more like a hand grenade with the pin pulled. The dormant chemical inside of her slowly stirring to what will end in a fiery explosion. The best I can do is move her away from others, far enough that her shrapnel can't reach. I've seen what a cold and calculating, or even a lukewarm and vengeful Ophelia can do. There's no telling what she's capable of with the hinges blown right off her. "Come on." I half pull, half guide her to the farthest table from the counter. It's the one under the cloud painting, where light struggles to reach. Traditionally, it's the place where couples go to sit and whisper forbidden promises to each other, or break up away from public view. It's the table where Blair O'Brien sits when she doesn't want anyone to interrupt her writing. Ophelia allows me to sit her down without a fight, but her pupils dodge my sight like they might avoid the blinding light of an eclipse. To see me would be to acknowledge a reality she's not quite ready to face. She reminds me of myself when I found Trevor and Cindy together, torn in half between two worlds, the one before and the one I had to face despite myself. Reality changed for Ophelia when she spoke. I turned to look back at the counter, and never has the Aquilow's dining room looked so big. An ocean of tables and chairs separate me from my friends, and it seems unbelievable that sound could carry so far as to reach them. Gulliver teeters between sitting and standing, fighting his need to rush over and take control of the situation, or comfort his lover. Annabelle covers her mouth with both hands, like a bystander who just witnessed a gruesome accident, one that she was responsible for causing. Only Petunia looks like she's got a handle on things. Lacking context serves as a shield, allowing her to float just above the situation, outside the range of comprehension. "Green tea," I tell her, hoping my voice carries all the way to one of them and they understand my meaning. Then, without waiting for anyone's permission or acknowledgement, I sit opposite Ophelia and take her hands in mine. There's none of the resistance that I would have otherwise expected from her. My touch doesn't cause convulsions or prompt her to vomit. She doesn't even pull back, letting me wrap my fingers around hers. "How dare you?" she asks after letting the moment linger. It wasn't me. I want to tell her that it wasn't me, that it was a misguided neophyte trying her hand at something bigger than herself who forced the confession from her lips. But that's not the conversation I want to have. "What do you mean Doris killed your parents?" Having the confession voiced back to her, calm as a morning mist, manages to soothe Ophelia. The frown lifts from her brow and the confusion clears from her eyes. Her trembling lips even out before pulling back into a forbidding expression. The panic vanquished, Ophelia returns to her senses. The crisis is avoided, but at the cost of her sudden vulnerability. Like an experienced painter, she plasters over the cracks in her personality until there's nothing left to see. At a quick glance, the wall would look pristine, but even with everything repaired, I can still see where the damage was. I can still imagine the cracks. "You're dodging the issue," she says, and attempt to get back control of the conversation. "I'm not angry," I explain. "I never knew Doris, just what everyone else told me. If you think she killed your parents, I want to know why. Are those bones you were trying to get out of the gate in the forest? Are those your parents? Where's the tea? Something about this topic of conversation sapped the warmth out of the air. I could swear the air conditioning is blasting at full strength, or that the front door has been thrown wide open. It's like being pulled back into the forest that night, with my feet sodden and the cold, wet leaves all around me. I could really use some warm tea. It's my mom, she says, confessing of her own free will this time. That's my mom's skull. All her bones are stuck in the vines of that door. And your ancestors put them there, Miriam. Pieces that have long been shapeless in my mind suddenly find their place, snapping together, their seams vanishing as they merge into larger, more complex assemblies. The portrait is far from complete. There are still too many holes that fragments should fill, but I finally have a vague idea of what the puzzle is meant to look like once complete. The ingredients are starting to make sense, despite the lack of recipe. Why would she do that? I ask, though I desperately want to push back and contradict her instead. Her habitual condescension makes a brief appearance, pulling on her brow while pushing down her eyelids. Doesn't last. However much she wants to stare down at me through her nostrils, she recognizes the opportunity for what it is. You don't bridge the inferno with brick and mortar. Sure, there's a physical door, but the passage itself is made of souls, of lives, of suffering, and of all the complex and ethereal materials that make life difficult to experience and understand. Like baking a cake from hopes and dreams, what she suggests is a passage made from things immaterial and faint. But what else can I expect from a door that leads to hell, or the inferno, as I keep hearing it called? So the bones are only part of it, she interrupts. You want to know what I have against you and your family? There's 2 generations of mine woven into that gate, and I'm positive that if I stick around long enough to let it happen, I'll be joining them too. Doris would never. There's no outrage behind Helen's words. She's not clutching her pearls out of shock or fanning herself to avoid getting the vapors or whatever. She's simply stating that, to the best of her knowledge, Doris Dufour would never. Doris would never kill. She would never hurt anyone. And she would never subject them to torture for her own goals. Also, would she even know how to do that kind of magic? Doris would never, but also Doris could never. Unless there's a side of my formidable predecessor that I've yet to discover. Well, I've yet to meet Doris in person, but it does seem out of character, based on what I know. The Aquilo Cafe had taken on a strange atmosphere after Ophelia's confession. Much like that one time I burnt a batch of muffins, an incident so rare it worried patrons and friends for a full day. The lingering smell of singed oatmeal haunted the dining room, and with it an unease at the unusual situation. This was something similar, but obviously far more visceral. The weight wasn't limited to the smell, but instead dug in on a spiritual level. While I attempted to get a measure of Ophelia's confession, my friends at the counter observed from afar. Annabelle looked mortified and Petunia intrigued, but Gulliver seemed trapped. Even from the corner of my eye, I could see that protective instinct of him, bubbling through his being like a long simmering broth. If allowed, he would have rushed in, scooped Ophelia up like a wounded child, escaping into the night with her in his arms. Needless to say, the night did not stretch long after that. By the time I was done with Ophelia, or she was done with me, everyone had somewhere better to be. Even me. I know that Ophelia isn't the most reliable source, and even through Annabelle's magic, she may not be telling the truth, but the ghost of Doris had lost some of its warmth. In the wake of events, I cleaned up as best I could. The floors were swept and the tables wiped, but midway through taking the dishes out of the dishwasher, I snapped. Home wasn't home anymore. I didn't feel welcome or safe. Without thinking, without hesitation, I hurried out the front door, not even bothering to lock it behind me. Who would trespass into the Aquilo? The streets were empty at this time of night anyway. At least, that's what I thought, until I found Helen Edna, notary public, taking a leisurely stroll in front of Aquilo Border Park. She didn't act surprised or perturbed by my appearance. I got the feeling from her nonchalance that this was the kind of encounter she would often have with Doris, a comparison that hit a little bit different tonight. Doris wasn't someone to trifle with, Helen lays out, her eyes drinking in the sights of a sleeping Aquilo. However, I can't imagine her turning to murder, and it took a lot to stoke her fires. She chose mercy on a hunger demon. That says a lot about her character. It does. I always thought that Doris wasn't able to destroy the demon, but time taught me that, while still possibly the case, there was more to it than that. Doris, from the stories I was told, always went for the path less traveled. Her solutions weren't implicitly pacifist. Rather, she leaned towards the adventurous. So you're saying Ophelia's parents had it coming? My question draws a frown from Helen. Cultivated indifference is something she wears well, almost as well as she does her couture pencil skirts and expensive blouses. Nonchalance hangs on her features as effortlessly as the light beige jacket she chose to wear on her nightly walk. A frown, however, looks ugly on her. It's an ill-fitting expression. Like pants that are too tight or a coat that sits too heavy, that level of frustration makes Helen look uncomfortable. No, she says, adamant in her answer. I can't imagine anyone who deserves that kind of death. Or rather, that Doris would make herself anyone's executioner. She looks across the road and into the darkness of the park. Shadows shift in the struggling light, suggesting the presence of the nightly denizens of Aquilo going about their business. I squint, hoping to catch a glimpse of Patience in his white attire, or the albino bats that seem to disappear on nights when he's about. Perhaps the fox is wandering the bushes and paths, hunting for whatever it is dead things chase for sustenance. But it wouldn't be difficult to pin the demise of Ophelia's parents on Doris, especially if it has any of the hallmarks of a Dufour touch. Leaning into the empty street, Helen looks to her left, then her right. Then she walks across, confident that I'll follow, or comfortable that if I don't, our conversation is over. But that's the thing. I jog to catch up. None of it smells of Dufour. Human skulls, creeping vines, portals to hell. We make biscotti and fancy tea. The closest thing to an inferno in my repertoire is broiled habanero stuffed mushrooms. How does Ophelia look at the Hellgate and decide that Doris, of all people, is to blame? Busy with my interrogation, I barely notice that Helen isn't going home. Her nightly walk is taking her into Aquilo Border Park, and me right along with her. The street lamps lose their power the deeper we dig into the sparse population of maples and birch. Moonlight does a poor job of replacing the orange glow, dusting the gravel paths and benches with a faint blue light instead. Annoyed at either the question, my continued presence, or both, Helen stops and sighs. Her arms drop to her sides and her chin goes up a few inches. Exasperation isn't the most difficult thing to draw from Helen Edna, notary public, but she usually keeps her expression subdued and under control. Maybe you need to explore that question further, Miriam, she says, reining in her short patience. Why would she come to that conclusion? Something about the how, when, why, and what of that portal's creation makes her think that Doris is the who. I can almost hear her ex-husband speak through her. This is Detective Aaron Wilson's approach. Not only how he weeds through criminal events, but his entire approach to life. To his detriment, everything is a case for Wilson. Okay, I start excitedly. So, How does one go about making a portal to hell then? And why? Helen has started walking again, setting herself on the gravel path that goes through the park and around the old tree stump in the middle. Following it, we'll cross back and forth between the United States and Canada, with only an owl and maybe some skunks to monitor us. We'll probably cross paths with the lady with the stroller and the tall man who sings. There might be others that will manifest. Some of the denizens whose shadows have been the only clue to their existence, finally showing their faces. Miriam, Helen snaps at last. I don't know. She turns around to face me, adjusting the strap on her fancy leather bag. Chasing a strand of hair from her face with a breath, she seems to be struggling to contain her annoyance. Under her gaze, I feel like a child who's been pestering her mother for a toy I don't deserve. I'm not a witch, she continues. I'm not a member of the Inquisition, the Pilvists, or even the church congregation. Unlike Miss Lagacé or Dr. Payne, I have no interest in learning any magic either for fun or out of grief. During the last few decades of Doris's life, I was satisfied being her most down-to-earth friend. The mystical, the bizarre, and the magical aspects of Doris's life, I was satisfied to know little about them. The law of two countries, how to run a business, the intricacies of accounting and tax and mediation, these are all the magics I can be bothered to learn. If you're looking for someone who talked with Doris about the occult and the arcane, you'd have to ask... She trails off, the embers of her frustration growing dark and cold in the process. Like a simmering pot freezing over in a second, Helen Edna's mood goes from a boil to solid ice. Even her expression, usually stern and unyielding at the best of times, softens. Every inch of tension in her muscles is released, and she deflates like a failed soufflé. I don't think I've ever seen Helen like this before. Then again, when have I ever witnessed the mighty Helen Edna faced with something she can't control? When was she ever pitted against something she couldn't browbeat into submission? Like me, she faces a foe that can't be defeated. Our common enemy is as immaterial as an afterthought, as ethereal as the space between the stars. What does even the great notary public of Aguilo have when faced against an existential inevitability? Did she also try and fail to keep the stiff upper lip when Doris passed away? Or did her spine stay straight and her eyes remain cold as steel? I'd have to ask Olivia, I conclude. I expect the softness in Helen to be ephemeral. Now that the facts are laid between us, her spine should stiffen once again, and her gaze should go back to being the ramparts to her soul. Maybe it's because we're shrouded by night, hidden in Aguilo Border Park, where strange things coalesce, but Helen keeps her guard down. And you can't, she adds, reaching a hand to touch my shoulder. So you turn to whoever else you think might help. I'm sorry. I don't have any answers for you. I'm struggling not to think about Olivia, and I guess you are too, in your own way. I nod, though it's not the exact truth. I'm chasing several threads, as is often the case with me, but I haven't lost focus on saving Olivia. It's okay, I say, taking her hand in mine. I was trying to clear my own head when I saw you, and I thought that maybe I had some answers. I wish I did. She smiles, a rare thing to witness and difficult to see under the struggling light. While not an answer, Helen did provide me with a path. If I want to know why Ophelia assumes Doris killed her parents, I need Olivia. This only serves to reinforce my resolve to save my friend. But Helen doesn't need to know that. I should let you go, I mumble, eager to go home and plot Olivia's salvation anew. Right, she answers, the old Helen creeping back into her own skin. And I have a client to meet. We part ways, both knowing we'll see each other tomorrow over coffee. I walk with fresh resolve to stand firm against death, while Helen's heels tap down the gravel path on her way to see a client at 2 a.m. in a darkened park. That's Aquilo for you.
Absolutely not.
Annabelle, as expected, isn't thrilled with my idea. Which is fine. She's not the fulcrum of this particular lever. I can bake a cake without chocolate after all, and while I do prefer the taste of rich cocoa, I can live with white sponge and strawberry fillings. My point is, while I'd rather have her be a willing participant to my mischief, Annabelle could sit this one out and the feast would still come together. My target is one whom I have a far more nebulous read on. It doesn't matter how much I like Pete, we're not as close as the years have allowed Annabelle and me to become. And at the end of the day, it's a massive ask of me to request her help today. The dining room is empty, a rare occurrence while the door sign reads open. Usually, there's a lineup in front of the Aquilo almost every morning. I've seen Michael shiver under a half-inch of snow, waiting for his morning cup of coffee in a blizzard. In the Northeast, however, it isn't snow that chases people indoors. Arctic winds have nothing on freezing rain and sleet when it comes to killing business in a small town. They'll come, of that there is no doubt. As sure as potato salad will spoil in the sun, the residents of Aquilo will come. No amount of downpour will keep the smell of buttery pastries and comforting coffee from drawing them in. Until then, we have a few moments to discuss my plan. It's like a house of cards, I explain. I've been trying to pull it apart from the top, taking out one card after another without ever getting to the bottom. But if I can pull that one piece out from underneath, the whole thing comes tumbling down.
Still no,
Annabelle insists.
You're already flying too close to the sun. No way you're pulling us up to have our wings melt off.
After listening attentively to my idea, Pete has been watching us go back and forth with detached interest. Her right cheek rests in the palm of her hand as she leans over the counter. Wisps of caramel-scented mist lose themselves up her nostrils as she enjoys the smell of her coffee. But even that, or the pumpkin seed muffin on her plate, fails to completely bring her back to us. At first, I assumed it was the damage from yesterday's drinking and the drama that had my friend in such a lethargic state. For sure it was during the first few minutes of her visit. Her steps were sluggish and her smile, while genuine, lacked the ease and warmth Petunia's known for. Sugar and caffeine had failed to lift her mood and inject the necessary energy for her to be herself again.
This wouldn't be the dumbest thing you've done,
Petunia pipes up. It's not clear who she's talking to. Annabelle and I both have a rich history of getting into stupid situations. In unison, as if rehearsed, we each point a finger at ourselves, raising our eyebrows to ask the obvious question.
Yes,
Pete confirms. Both of you, but mostly Annabelle. Since when are you worried about stepping on anyone's toes?
I'm trying to protect a friend.
And so is Miriam.
Miriam doesn't know what you've been through.
Petunia isn't exactly stunned into silence. The way her lips thin down under the pressure of her jaw and the wandering of her eyes to look around the empty dining room tells me she knew this was coming. There it is, she seems to say without uttering a single word. It's that subtle change in sizzle when a chicken breast is seized in the pan, but before it starts to dry out and char, noticeable only to those experienced enough to hear the difference. Both my friends are smart in their own way. It's seeing those differences in proportions between clever and thoughtful that defines the depth of their friendship. These two were tight before Petunia left Aquilo, and while Annabelle has become my accomplice in the time since, our common sauce has yet to simmer as long.
And you do?
Petunia's voice is soft, as if she were wearing gloves lest she scratch the surface of Annabelle's temper.
Honey, I love you like an otter loves fish, but you're not Fred.
She raises her arms above the counter, letting them fall, palm up, upon the varnished wood. Half-empty cups of coffee rattle against plates while teaspoons dance in place for a moment. You have to admire how dramatic Pete can be when trying to prove a point.
There isn't enough blood in these veins to pay you back for all you've done for me, she goes on, showing the interior of her elbows. But Fred knows the stuff I haven't told even you. My parents drove me from home, but the Pilvists drove me from Aquilo.
What a subtle poison lack of trust can be. Its bitter taste immediate to notice, but with no antidote to lessen the sting. Annabelle squares her jaw, gritting her teeth together in a way I don't think I've ever seen her do before. She's not mad yet, not at Pete anyway. That's not how that poison works. Right now, it's all pain, but after a while, it'll become self-recrimination. Then there's the blow to the ego, an unexpected attack to her pride as someone who makes a point of being available to confide in.
You make them sound positively nefarious,
I say, hoping to move the conversation along. Petunia's eyes narrow and her posture loosens up. She raises her hands in a capitulatory gesture, like someone about to state a fact as unpleasant as it is inescapable.
Way I see it, there are two evils in this world: malice and selfishness. Anything else you can attribute to ignorance, trauma, or a skewed perspective. The Pilvists are a little bit of both.
I refill everyone's mug, casting an automatic look at the cream and sugar to make sure there remains plenty. While I appreciate the glimpse into her inner philosophy, it does little to shed light as to why Pete thinks the Pilvists are worth running from Aquilo for.
Both malicious and selfish, or ignorant and traumatized? They're keeping chains on a nature goddess. You had a little fairy in a cage for a while, didn't you?
I shouldn't be surprised that Pete knows about my macaron sprite. While the road might not have gone both ways completely, I'm sure there's precious little that Annabelle didn't tell her best friend.
We called it a sprite. Turns out fairies are something else entirely. But it's not like Doris left me with a comprehensive bestiary of the local weird life. With all due respect to Doris,
Annabelle pipes in, making an effort to shake off her mood.
She didn't leave you with much aside from a recipe book and a coffee shop. Then again, now that I say it out loud,
it's both a lot and not enough. I've been thinking the same thing.
Or Doris wasn't the one to keep track of that stuff,
Petunia says, sipping her syrupy sweet coffee.
Ian didn't write the rules to being a Pilvist, and he knows about as little about his goddess as you did about your sprite.
Hot coffee burns my fingertips through the mug, and I let it. The warm pain helps me focus, and it reminds me of how dangerous even the most mundane thing can be.
I still don't know the first thing about that sprite. And how is that working out for you?
I think back to Orleans, who nearly lost his life to an army of macaron sprites, and of Eric, who kept risking his fingers yet couldn't keep them out of the creature's cage. I did my best to rehabilitate the sprite, to learn from it, to understand it, but it never allowed any of its secrets to spill.
Didn't. I set it free last summer. I like to imagine we'd reached a truce at that point, but I doubt it. I'm glad it's free and all, but I hope to never see it, or anything like it, again.
Petunia nods, satisfied by both the sugary sludge she's drinking and my explanation. She sets down the mug, drumming her fingers on the wood surrounding it.
See? Ignorance. Ignorance you are wise enough to recognize, and that's why you don't belong with the Pilvists. Finally, Annabelle says. Some common sense.
Petunia smiles, but goes no further in acknowledging the outburst.
The Pilvists are ignorant, yes, but they're also selfish, both as a cult and individuals within the cult. They're all there for a reason, looking for something, waiting for a miracle to happen just for them, all the while content in letting a majestic entity rage against the walls of her cage. So, yeah, I escaped my parents because they're cloud worshippers, but I ran from Aquilo because the Pilvist cult isn't open to letting things run away from them.
Annabelle puts her hand on Pete's arm, quieting the drumming of fingers in the process.
Doesn't sound like something you should be going back to.
I have to agree with Annabelle, I say, with a little reluctance.
I thought you might have a better understanding of how to bargain with that great cloud of theirs. Wrestle a miracle out of it. But I get what you're saying about the selfishness and all. This wins me a comforting smile from Annabelle, and I'm expecting the same from Pete at any moment. It doesn't mean I'm not going to try and find another way to save Olivia, especially not if I want to get to the bottom of Ophelia's accusations. But this is one warning too many for me to ignore. After all,
What?
Pete interrupts my musing. Hell no. We're going to make that deal with the Pilvist goddess, and you are getting that miracle, darling. But haven't you been listening? Ian, my parents, all the others, they feed that cloud your pastries and get minor blessings, ignoring the rattling of chains. But you can do better. You can set her free. Petunia's smile broadens at the thought of her explanation, the words having a mirth that escapes both Annabelle and me. All this talk of malice and selfishness, ignorance and trauma, it's made me aware of what that grin stretching across her lips could mean. There's a place in all of Pete's evils for something else. Revenge. And what is a cult without a god? She asks, looking to Annabelle to answer. Nothing.
Aquilo is written by J.F. Dubow and narrated and produced by me, Amy Frost. If you enjoyed this podcast and would like to hear more, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or your preferred podcast platform. Want to support the show? Buy us a coffee. Go to ko-fi.com/Aquilo to donate. Aquilo has a Patreon. Visit patreon.com/Aquilo for details. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram under the username Aquilo.